In reading class today, students were focusing in on the concepts of understanding the plot structure of short stories and of their core books. Their mastery objective was that students would be able to complete a plot diagram after reading a text. Prior to today's lesson, we really emphasized over the last few days the concepts of the elements of a story. Students were able to go ahead and recognize the elements within various stories and identify, for instance, the setting, the main characters, what is the problem of the story, what are the events, and finally, is the solution to the story. Now, although the plot diagram is very similar to the elements of a story, there are some differences. One thing that is the same between the two is that there is a plot, and that is a series of related events in which the problem is developed throughout the story. In addition to the plot diagram starts off with the exposition. And this is where the main setting and the characters and the main conflict or problem starts to become developed. After the exposition, it leads to the rising action. And this is the development of the problem, which ultimately leads to the climax of the story. In the climax, this is at the point of which the problem or conflict reaches its high point. This is kind of that turning point throughout the story where now all the actions that were leading up to this point start to now turn and lead us towards eventual resolutions. After a climax, we make that turn and we start focusing in on the concepts of the falling action. And these are just a series of events that occur after the climax and lead towards the resolution. And in the resolution, you have the final outcome of the plot during which the problem is resolved. Not necessarily always the happy ending, but it is the ending to the story, preferably, obviously, for our fairy tales, kind of those happy endings. To take a look at a familiar story for most of us, we're going to explore the concept of plot diagram in relation to the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Now, our plot diagram, as you see here, is almost kind of like a roller coaster ride. It starts off with the exposition, builds in intensity with the rising action, reaches the point of no return at the climax where now everything cascades downward towards the resolution to the story. So we then go ahead and explore the falling action followed up by the resolution. In Goldilocks and Three Bears, we can go ahead and identify the exposition as being when Goldilocks is told by her mother to buy muffins in the next town. She is warned not to take the shortcut through the forest. The rising action is when she disobeys her mother and travels through the shortcut in the woods. This leads to our climax where everything starts to change. And that is eventually she discovers an empty house and decides to enter that house. Once she's entered the house, we enter the falling action. And in the falling action, she goes ahead and eats the porridge, she sits on the chair and breaks the chair, she eventually tries the beds, decides to sleep on one bed, and falls asleep. While asleep, this now leads eventually towards our resolution. And in the resolution, the bears who own the home return home, discover that Goldilocks is there, and she eventually runs off never to return again. And the overall theme of the lesson that's learned is that Goldilocks recognizes that she should have always listened to her mother. So, in looking at the plot diagram, we can see that it basically starts off with the exposition, more towards the beginning of the book. It builds in intensity with the rising action, leads to the climax, eventually goes ahead and filters down to the falling action, which then presents us with the resolution at the end. Throughout our unit of study of historical fiction, students will come back to our plot diagram and eventually be able to take their core book and dissect it and analyze it into the different parts that would belong on our plot diagram. So again, our mastery objective that students should be able to accomplish is that by the end of this unit, students will be able to complete a plot diagram after reading their text.